Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Momentum Boost. I'm your host, Adrienne Gold Davis, and I hope you had a wonderful, wonderful holiday season. I know I did, and I'm honored to be with all of you tonight. So tonight, I have the absolute pleasure of speaking with a woman named Mem Bernstein. Mem is a respected venture philanthropist. Do you know that term? She's a leader in Jewish education. She is the chairman of the board of the Avichai Foundation and a trustee of both Karen Kesher, which means the Rainbow Foundation, and the Tikva Fund. Now, these foundations support all manner of Jewish life, and we are all the beneficiaries of her generosity and her commitment to our children, to our people. She's also the author of two books, one called Aging Parents and You, and the other, The Sandwich Generation. She's speaking to us from her Manhattan office, and you can even hear the fire trucks and the New York traffic in the background. And she's a sophisticated, sensitive, and very self-aware woman. And she has an incredible amount of power. And she uses that power in a way that we respect and admire and wish we could emulate. So Mem joins us tonight to share her unique experience from stepping up and taking over the leadership of several major foundations after the death of her beloved husband, Zalman Bernstein. Mem shares how her Jewish upbringing and her Jewish home and the Jewish home that she and her beloved Zalman built for their children has influenced the way she listens, the way she leads, and the way that she makes choices that grow access to Jewish education for people around the world. Welcome, Mem. I am so delighted, so honored that you found the time to meet with us today. And that painting behind your beautiful face is like such a perfect set. So welcome.
Thanks. I'm very happy to be with you, and I'm glad you like the painting. The artist's name is Judith Voss, and she's a San Francisco artist. And well, maybe it was LA, California anyway, California artist.
You see, this is like completely indicative of your generosity. I give you a compliment, and you made sure to ensure that the artist got her due. And this is endemic of who you are. So listen, Mem, we know that you've devoted your adult life really to raising your own Jewish children and to ensuring and facilitating access to Jewish education for all of our children. And we thank you for that. So I know that you know that at Momentum, we focus on the mother as the change maker, just to ensure that the same thing comes to pass. After all, we figure that, who decides where the kid's going to go to school, if not the mother. Right. So you yourself, I read, did not have a formal Jewish education, and your Jewish identity is very deep and very secure. So why do you feel that formal Jewish literacy in all of its forms and formal Jewish education was such an important place to put all of your resources?
Well, it's interesting. I think first it's fair to say that I acquired whatever love for Judaism I have from my parents and my grandparents. I had grandparents until I was 40 years old, fortunately, which is unusual, I know. And they were alert and wonderful. In fact, my grandfather at 96 died on the way to the nursing home where he was a volunteer.
Wow.
So I learned that from my parents. And you have to understand, when I married Zalman, I basically inherited upon his death the foundations to work with. And
okay, I'm going to stop you for a minute. Okay. For the purpose of our viewers who do not know, can you share a little bit about what those foundations are? Because this is in the basis of your philanthropic work in the last years.
Okay, so there are three foundations. Avichai and Tikva were set up by my late husband before his death, and Karen Kesher was set up by the trustees of his estate after. And all three deal with different aspects in the Jewish world, and each one has its own board, and I sit on all of the boards. I chair the Avichai Foundation, and that's what we do. We do Jewish in all forms, everything from Jewish day school education, Jewish summer camping, leadership, and Jewish education writ large in Israel, the United States, and the former Soviet Union.
Wow.
Is that good enough?
Well, I mean, yeah.
Right, but I don't want to bore everybody, so that'll be good enough.
You're so not boring anybody, but you said something, and I wanna click in on that. You said that after your husband passed away, that you stepped into the role of leading the board and being part in a formal way. What kind of transition was that? Were you involved in any way before he passed? And how did you deal with the transition from, pillow talk to?
Right. Okay, so firstly, when he passed away, he left me his seat on the board. However, within the bylaws, I wasn't to become chair until several years later, 8 or 10 years later. And during the first 7 years of his passing, Arthur Freed was the chairman of the board. And Arthur said to me, as soon as we started working together, I don't want to have a chairman in waiting for the next 10 years, so we'll work as partners together. And that's what we did. And after 7 years, Arthur felt it was time for me, and so I stepped up to the plate. It's interesting, when Zalman died, I thought to myself, Arthur's going to be chair for 10 years? Why? I could be chair. But only after I started working with him did I realize I could not have been chair. And it took me many, many years to really feel myself comfortable in the role. And fortunately for me, when I did partner with him during his tenure, he then partnered with me during mine. So I never felt alone, and I never felt, which I wouldn't have anyway, totally responsible, because you're not totally responsible. You're responsible with a group of board members who are responsible with you. And so that's how that structure went. In terms of how I prepared myself, I knew what was going on within the foundations because Zalman shared with me. I didn't realize that I was being tested for the role. You mentioned pillow talk, because that's what it was. He would come home and he would ask my opinion about this or that, or this project, that project, and I would give it, but I had no earthly idea that any of it was being considered. And then only when I came to sit on the board years later, did I see really that some of the suggestions I had made were actually implemented. So that's how I knew. But in terms of my own life before that, when I was married to my first husband, and for the years that we were separated, divorced after, because I was divorced for 10 years before I married Zalman, I was involved with the Federation in California, in San Jose, California. And so I was chairman and campaign chairman of the Federation boards, and the Jewish Community Center, and the board of the day school, all of those things. So I was prepared for that. But that was very different to what I then undertook. And it was not an easy transition going from a volunteer who volunteers for a federation position, let us say, to becoming a member or a trustee or a chairman of a private foundation. You no longer are a volunteer, you become the boss, so to speak. And although you don't consider yourself the boss, and you don't consider yourself bossing anybody around, which I never did, the truth of the matter is that when I came in, 2 of the people with whom I worked almost immediately wanted to quit because they didn't want to work with me. And I had no idea what the problem was. What was the problem? And I can only look back on it. And fortunately, they did not leave. But I had a lot to learn about working with people who were actually working in the foundation, earning a living, and were dependent on that foundation. So it's a different mindset, and you do have to adjust to it. You have to learn. And I did learn. I think I learned. But since we have such great retention, I can only hope I did learn.
I wonder if it's your nature or it's hindsight, because it sounds to me like you stepped into tremendous power, and that is both daunting and terrifying and marvelous, but at the same time, tremendous humility when you figured out that you didn't know what you didn't know.
Right, but I was very, very lucky. I had a great mentor in Arthur Freed. He was a wonderful mentor, and I really learned a lot from him. I never felt that I was stepping into a position of power, but I was, of course I was. And I don't know I could have gone probably either way, and I think I went the right way. But yeah, but I had a wonderful mentor and teacher, and I was very, very fortunate. Sometimes I look at people and the way they deal with their philanthropy and think today, that's not so good. You don't want to be shouting like that. You don't want to take your ball and go home. You know, you want to learn how to play with the people in the playpen. And so, yeah, there was a lot to learn, and hopefully I got there.
You know, you mentioned earlier that your parents were tremendous role models for you of Jewish
Mm-hmm.
life in a non-formal way.
Right.
And I understand you were not raised with wealth and that kind of privilege that goes along with it. So I'm sure that the transitioning into that was also part of the equation. And people get very afraid of people who have that kind of privilege as though somehow they're not human. You know, it's like anyone else.
No, it's true. Yeah, you're right.
And it's
Look,
so yeah.
I'm sorry.
No, you go
My
ahead.
parents did not have financial wealth. And I only came into it after I married my first husband. We went into business together. Unfortunately, we were very successful. But I didn't. But what I got from them was generosity. I learned from my parents and my grandparents. There was never a door that was locked in my home. People came in, they were welcomed in. The truth is, I didn't know that I wasn't financially comfortable until I became comfortable. How would I have known that? Kids don't know. You know, you grow up and you think this is what life is for everyone.
Sure.
And so I was just very lucky that I was modeled by parents who knew how to give, and they gave whatever they could give. They gave, and that's how I was raised. Mostly, it was by seeing how they did their giving, with their generosity, with their hospitality, that I learned really what it was to be a Jew. In fact, I remember telling somebody I had gone to the shiva of one of my relatives when I was probably in my mid-20s. And as I was sitting there, my aunts and uncles were around, and I heard one of my aunts say to a cousin of mine, "Have you called your mother this week?" And my cousin said, "No, I didn't." And my aunt went on to berate her about, how could you not call your mother? You're supposed to call your mother. But, and all of a sudden it occurred to me that that was how I learned to be a Jew. I learned by the way my parents and their siblings and my aunts and uncles behaved with one another, ethically, morally, with consideration, and everyone knew the role they were to play. Yeah,
You
it
know,
was very interesting.
when I hear you say this, the first thing that comes to my mind is that generosity and philanthropy is not necessarily financial entirely.
That's
And,
right.
and that, caring for your parents and having a generous heart and being generous with your time and your volunteerism and so on
Right.
is another way of being a philanthropist of love.
Right. It's true. Yeah. And it doesn't matter whether or not, really, when you think about it, it doesn't really matter whether or not you like your parents. It doesn't. The Torah tells you, honor your parents. So you don't have to like them, but you have to, as I said, behave in a certain way. And that's what you try to learn to do.
It sounds to me like Jewish values in general, which is, of course, Momentum's key focus, is to focus on Jewish values, to attach yourself to Jewish values. But those very values seem to have formed the woman that you are. How did you manage to be so successful with your children? Did you do it the same way? Because I know one of your daughters, and I know that they're deeply involved in the Jewish world. Did you do it like your parents and grandparents did, or was it a more formalized process?
I'm not sure that I can answer that question, but I can tell you that one of the things I did without knowing, I just did what felt comfortable to me. And what do I mean by that? It was easy for me and comfortable for me to say yes when people asked, could they come to my home for a meeting? Could they say, I have an event at my house? It was a Jewish community in which I wanted to live. I wanted to be part of that community. And with that comes responsibility and comes being called upon again and again. So it's interesting. I listened when my children were asked a question when they were probably in their early 20s about their family life. And they responded by saying, they were raised in a Jewish home, that when they were kids, they often sat on the top of the stairs and looked down into the living room at all the meetings that were going on there. And I never even thought about it when I was raising them. I didn't think about it. I just did what was comfortable. Now, my children probably would say that there were many things I didn't do right, but I certainly gave them the Jewish because that's who I was. So it wasn't like I was trying to be somebody I wasn't. That's who I was. If I had tried, I'm sure I couldn't have been consistent in the trying, which is not a good thing. So, and for me, I didn't have a formal Jewish education. So it was really all the fun of being Jewish. It was the holidays, it was Shabbat dinner, it was community. It wasn't learning, because I didn't have the learning to give them. They got it at school, of course. I sent them to Jewish day schools, but that largely came because I married a Jewish man from England, and he was raised as an Orthodox Jew. There was no other Jew to be had at the time. And he was 10 years older than I. And so he came with that as part of the package that he brought to the marriage. And I was more than happy to take it on. I was raised in a kosher home, so continuing that was not an issue. And when it was time to, I laugh about this, when it was time to kosher the dishes, we went to Santa Cruz, to the ocean, and my kids were running down, putting dishes into the ocean and letting them float away.
Of course they were.
Right. But it was great. But it was that kind of thing, you learned just by the way you lived. And that's how my kids grew up. They learned by the way they lived.
Well, I hope this isn't too presumptuous, but it sounds to me like going with your natural instincts and what was pleasurable and comfortable for you was a tremendous lesson in moving, things forward in your life. But surely there have been things where you have had extraordinary growth that were not necessarily comfortable. I mean, I can't imagine becoming widowed and stepping into the role of what you did was not comfortable. So give us some suggestions from a Jewish perspective and from your experience. How do we do? Judaism obviously is a system of obligations, even more than it is rights. There are some things that are less comfortable. How do you manage the uncomfortable when the thing needs to be done?
That's interesting. Look, I mean, this is going to sound funny, but it's true. There are things I prefer to do that I might not do in public because it shouldn't be done if you're a good observant Jew. So you swallow hard and you behave properly. You just learn to behave.
You call your mother.
You call your mother, right? But I think the best advice I would give to anyone when things are tough, try and keep your mouth closed.
Oof.
Try and listen rather than speak.
Wow.
It benefits you in two ways. First of all, you get to hear what's going on and you can learn, and you don't make a fool of yourself by opening your mouth. So I think when times are difficult, it's always best to try and be quiet. I mean, I can't really imagine it any other way.
I'd love to hear some examples of that. The first thing that springs to my mind is that probably when you partnered with your mentor on that board, when you saw what you did not know, did you find yourself not speaking, even though you had a thought because you felt you were, there's that idea in Jewish life that you should always know your place.
Right. Well, I can tell you that when I first moved to Israel before, 10 years before going on the board, when I first moved to Israel, we had people over for Friday night dinner almost every Friday. And we had guests at the house, of course. I remember vividly sitting at my own table for many, many, many months, not speaking, because the guests at the table were so extraordinary. These are people who came to settle the land. They were in every way people I had never encountered before. And they had so much knowledge and so much to say and to share. I had nothing to give, nothing in my eyes. And I just listened. And the same was true on the board. Less so, perhaps, at the Avichai board because I was involved in community involvement. And so it's similar in many ways, not with the same responsibility, but similar in many ways. But of course, when Tikva got up and running, it was a whole different thing for me. And there was a lot of learning to do there. And again, I felt that it was more important for me to learn and listen than to speak. And so I did. But more than that, people, when you're in a meeting, people want to be heard. They just want to talk. They don't always have something worthwhile to say. So better just to listen, I think.
You are a mistress of humility.
I'm not really. Maybe it just comes off like that. I don't know. It's just, I just do my best. I don't know.
We all do our best. No, we don't all do our best. That's the problem. The desire to do your best. Sometimes that's Dianu. Okay, so, 2 years ago when the whole COVID thing started, Momentum, of course, had to do that pirouette, that pivot, where, we were already in the works of creating something that was outside of our trips, which, are our primary identity back then. But, we turned to online like so many other people did. And I think we did a fantastic job, if I do say so myself. But let's talk about Tablet, which I'm obsessed with. You were doing online resources before you had to because of COVID. Tell me what inspired that.
Well, I'll tell you from the beginning how it went. Let me think for a second. Okay, so it started like this. When I was not working on the foundation and I was living in Israel, the Rothschild Foundation had started to build, and by the way, Arthur Fried was the chairman of the Rothschild Foundation, had started to build libraries in schools in Israel. Mm-hmm. And Zalman asked me if I would have an interest in doing that. And I said, of course. And so we did. We started to build schools in libraries, libraries in schools.
Sure.
Then when Zalman passed away, Arthur said to me, I don't remember how it began. Maybe we were probably considering whether or not to move on with these libraries. And I went to San Francisco. I went home for a visit to San Francisco. And while I was there, the new public library opened and I went to see it. And I wrote to Arthur after, or called him, and I said, it's amazing. The library is fabulous. And every place you look, a Jewish name supported it, okay? Everywhere you look. However, Arthur, a most amazing thing, they have these little salons within the library itself. And on top of the salon, it's no Jewish name, the gay and lesbian section, the Afro-American section. I said, how did that happen? I don't understand that. And I said to him, and in these salons, I think they do programming. So I did some research, and this is what I came to find. When that main library was being built, they, of course, went to the Jewish donors in the city to raise money for it, and they did. But they ran short at the end, and they had tapped out on the Jewish community. And so they went to special interest groups to see if they could raise money for these salons within. They were like living rooms, like little rooms. And that's how it came to be. So then I said to Arthur, I think we should do programming in public library. We could do that. Why not? And so that's how it began. So then Arthur had a friend who had begun, I think it was called the Lipper Jewish Life series, a series of books, short biographies. And so we hired a woman whose name was Julie Sandorf. She started working with us. And I heard of a man named Matthew Brogan, I think Brogan was his last name, who was doing a lecture series in Seattle. And we hired him. And we intended to do lecture series in libraries across the United States. That's how we began the thinking. And then from there, we decided to do a book series, and it was called Next Book. And it was short biographical books about Jewish people, Jewish subjects, written by American Jews, or written by, yeah, they were all written by American Jews, and written on the subject of the subject. So if you were studying Maimonides, the man writing was a doctor. It was that sort of a thing. And so then we got into the series on books. And from there, we went to tablet. I remember. Julie was leaving next book, and Morty Landau brought to our attention Alana Newhouse, who was at the time the cultural editor of The Forward. Mm-hmm. And we took her, and she became the editor of Tablet, which had already begun as Tablet under Julie Sandorf. And then when Alana took it over, it became, I would have to say, a stronger Jewish cultural site. Uh-huh. And it also came at the time when newspapers were sort of going out of business. They were falling down because of the internet. And that's how that really got started. My recollection is not so clear on it. It's been a long time. But basically, that was how it got started. And I think the question you're asking me basically comes at the same time that the internet started to flourish, newspapers started to go down, and we were right there at the right time. In fact, I would have to say at the right time, at the right place, because we were one of the first to go online. That's right. And it was great, and it was easier, because today your competition is enormous. You hardly know what to read and where to turn to and how many hours in the day can you read. So we were lucky in timing for sure.
Well, so Mem, there's, a core value at Momentum is the principle of unity and mutual responsibility, unity without uniformity. And, you've prided yourself, I've seen, in creating very inclusive Jewish education, like across the spectrum. And can you tell us, I'd love to know how you define the principle of unity without uniformity?
Well, first of all, it's very, very succinctly defined within the Avichai Foundation, because any project that we did through Avichai in terms of Jewish education had to be writ large across the board. And it didn't matter what the denomination, it only mattered that whatever school or organization we were funding recognized Israel. And if they didn't, we wouldn't fund it. So in fact, there was a guideline and a border, and that was the border that you had to be within it, or you didn't get funding. And we feel that way today. It wasn't a matter of whether you practice orthodoxy or conservatism or reform. You had to recognize the state of Israel. And in terms of tablet, we moved to tablet because, again, you can't control who reads the material, which is a good thing.
Yes.
And you want to be broad enough to encourage others to read. So it was a way of including those who might not otherwise walk into a synagogue or walk into a day school or ever be part of a Jewish community. And it was always on our minds that we didn't want to pinpoint any denomination or any organization. It had to be because we could afford for it to be. If we couldn't, then perhaps it might have been different, but we had the great largesse of my late husband, and so we could afford to be generous throughout, and we tried our best to do that.
It's a beautiful thing and something to be very proud of. We know that baseless hatred is what destroyed the temple in Israel, and that it'll only be love with a purpose that will build it again. And you are a living manifestation of everything we stand for here. Unity without uniformity, and engagement with Israel, and a connection to Jewish values and generosity and taking action.
Okay, I have to get through the door when this is over, so let's keep it, so my head doesn't explode.
I'll send you the Momentum necklace. I think you are now an official Momentum poster girl. I honestly, I'm so honored to meet you and to have this time. And I want to thank you on behalf of us for hosting in your beautiful Jerusalem home.
Well, I have to tell you what goes around comes around. So when Avichai was on its spin down before we closed, we tried to help our employees to what's the word I'm looking for? To place them. We tried to place them. And one of our employees was placed with Manette at Momentum. She was, and this is interesting also because it was before COVID, and she was working with us. Her name was Rachel Abrams, and she worked with us in online learning. And when Momentum was looking toward online learning, they came to us and we went to them and we placed Rachel with them. And that was just before COVID. And then COVID struck and everyone had to go online. And she was placed at the right time in the right place. It was perfect. So turns out that Manette has a home in Jerusalem, right across from where I live. And she called me that day to ask me if I would host this event that she was putting on because she had run out of space. That's a good thing to happen to you, run out of space. And she asked me, and the only reason I said yes, because I had just flown to Israel, and 2 nights before I had 60 people into dinner, and 2 nights after this event, I was scheduled to do the same. And I would never have done it had Manette not asked me, but she did. And so, of course, I said yes. And I have to tell you, I had no expectations of what that lunch was going to be like. But as you well know, I hosted mothers and their sons or daughters who were lone soldiers in the IDF. I came away flying. I thought that lunch was fabulous. I thought the people were amazing. They were committed to Israel. The kids were great. They were great. And so, you know, one good deed, and there you go. I had an exceptional day. It was really special for me. So I should thank you and all of you because you made it happen. And I just was the beneficiary of it.
Oh, Mem, the Almighty should grant you continued strength and
Amen.
good health and
That's so
clarity and humility and wisdom.
Thank you.
To
Thank you.
continue giving the world and the Jewish people what you do. Thank you on behalf of all of us. Thank you.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
Such an honor to talk to you.
Thank you. Be well. Take care. Stay healthy.
You too. You too. Thank you so, so much for joining Momentum Boost and sharing your incredible wisdom with us. We hope you'll join us again sometime in the future. I found that just so moving. But right now, I'd be so grateful if you just take a moment, fill up that poll that's coming up on your screen. It helps us really to continue to provide relevant and meaningful programming for you. But for me, Adrienne Gold Davis, and all of us in Momentum Land, please remember that as we learn and grow together, that the highest form of wisdom is kindness. Good night, everyone.
I've got 1,000 questions coming from deep within. Wanna cut through the clutter. I need to know that my next move matters. And it all comes down to me, to be the change I wanna see. Unleash the energy, the synergy, that's where I wanna be. This feeling inside was there all along. Now I'm strong and I'm living with my power on. Wanna set my life in motion. Love, courage, and devotion. There's a spark to ignite. Flip the switch, bring the light, power on. I see you in my reflection, the tears of joy and pain. Tradition is our connection. Time